What would you do if your closest friend fell in front of you, and you knew there was nothing you could do to save him? There were no screams. No outbursts. Only trembling hands holding a body that had gone quiet. Ralph didn't shout. He simply whispered two words he had never said to Martin before: "Don't go." Memphis, Tennessee. A quiet April evening. On the second-floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel, Martin Luther King Jr. stepped outside and adjusted his collar. Down below, laughter floated up from the courtyard, his team getting ready for dinner. Inside the room, Ralph Abernathy stood still. He said nothing. But he watched Martin longer than usual. For over a decade, they had marched together, been arrested together, prayed together, and held each other up through storms of hatred. But never before had Ralph seen his friend's eyes look this calm. "Ralph," Martin called out, half laughing. "Are you ready for dinner yet?" A second later, the shot rang out. No one had time to react. Ralph ran toward the sound. He carried nothing, only his arms, open and desperate. He caught Martin as he fell, cradling his friend's body against his own. Blood seeped through the white cuffs. And in those moments, Ralph didn't look around. He bowed his head and whispered a prayer, not to save Martin, but so he wouldn't die alone. No one remembers exactly what Ralph said. But years later, in a quiet page of his journal, he wrote, "Faith is when you hold a man who has fallen, and still believe the world isn't lost." Would you like me to continue with the next section in the same voice? Ralph David Abernathy was born in a quiet corner of Linden, Alabama, in 1926. The youngest son of a sharecropper turned landowner, he grew up watching his father wake before dawn, not just to tend fields, but to make sure his neighbors had enough to eat. There was no speech about justice, no slogans on the wall. Just work. Just decency. Just a man doing what was right when no one was watching. At 19, Ralph enlisted in the U.S. Army. He served during World War II, not on the front lines, but in the Signals Corps. His job wasn't glamorous, it was quiet, methodical. He learned to listen, to wait, to understand that timing and silence could carry more weight than force. And maybe, somewhere between the routine and the radio static, Ralph began to believe that real strength was never loud. After the war, he went back to school on the GI Bill. He earned a degree in mathematics, then a master's in sociology. His professors expected him to teach, to follow a safer path. But Ralph returned to Montgomery and became a pastor. His first sermons were not fiery. His voice was gentle, steady. He spoke about compassion, about walking slowly with others, even when the road was rough. One elderly congregant once said, "Reverend Abernathy doesn't raise his voice. He raises your spirit." It was in that same church where he met another young pastor, sharp, passionate, and restless. Martin. They didn't become friends in a moment. It was a slow joining, like two rivers quietly meeting, one feeding the other. Years later, Ralph would say, "I never wanted to be a leader. I just couldn't stay seated when the world was hurting." Would you like me to continue with part 3, Ralph meets MLK and joins the Montgomery bus boycott? Montgomery, 1955. The air was thick with tension, though most folks still went about their days pretending not to notice. Buses kept moving. Shoes kept walking. But something was shifting, quietly, like a distant storm moving in, still too far to hear, but impossible to ignore. At First Baptist Church, Ralph Abernathy kept his sermons steady. He still visited the sick. Still stopped at the corner store for bread and milk like every other man. But inside, something pressed on him. It wasn't anger, it was a sense of waiting. As if the world was holding its breath for someone to act. Then came the news. A woman named Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat. She was small, polite, tired. But she said no. And that quiet no echoed louder than anyone expected. That same week, Ralph received a phone call from a young preacher across town, new to Montgomery, with a warm voice and a sharp mind. Martin Luther King Jr. didn't want to lead the protest. Not at first. He just wanted to help organize a meeting. Ralph agreed to attend. They met in the basement of a church. The room was dim, folding chairs pulled together in a circle. Ralph sat across from Martin. No one raised their voice. They listened. And as the conversation circled around action and caution, Ralph noticed something. Martin was calm, but not passive. He spoke with conviction, but also with care. After the meeting, Ralph walked Martin to his car. "You're thoughtful," Ralph said. "That matters more than people know." Martin smiled. "And you're steady. That matters more than they remember." The Montgomery bus boycott began the next day. It wasn't loud. There were no marches, no television crews. Just people walking, day after day, to work, to school, to church, choosing dignity over convenience. Ralph offered his church as a meeting point. He helped coordinate carpools, food donations, late-night planning. He answered calls from worried elders and angry neighbors. Every morning, he checked on the elderly ladies who now walked 2 miles in worn shoes to clean houses across town. He never gave speeches in those early days. He showed up. He stayed late. He said little. And every night, before locking the church doors, he stood for a moment at the back of the sanctuary. One quiet man, keeping watch over a rising movement. Would you like me to continue with Part 4, the founding of SCLC and the journey through arrests, shared prayers, and constant risk? By early 1957, it had become clear that Montgomery was only the beginning. The bus boycott had ended with a ruling in their favor, but the deeper struggle, the one against the roots of injustice, was still waiting. Cities across the South were simmering. There were whispers of marches, meetings, resistance. But there was no center yet. No voice to hold it all together. Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King Jr. met again, this time not in the basement of a local church, but in Atlanta. Alongside a handful of other pastors and organizers, they formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. It was not born in thunder. It came together over slow talks, shared meals, and handwritten notes passed between pulpits. Its goal was simple: to make nonviolence a way forward, not just a tactic. Ralph wasn't the man who took the microphone. He was the one who arranged the chairs before the press conference and swept the floor after it ended. He kept track of the funds, mapped the routes, made sure the children had shoes before a march. And when threats came, and they often did, he stayed anyway. The arrests began not long after. In Albany. In Birmingham. In Selma. Sometimes both men were taken. Sometimes just one. But Ralph always waited. Always visited. Always made sure someone knew where the other was being held. In narrow jail cells, they didn't speak loudly. They shared scriptures. They hummed spirituals. They prayed, not for deliverance, but for endurance. One night, after being released, Ralph sat beside Martin on a church pew. The lights were off. The sanctuary was empty. "You ever think about stopping?" Ralph asked. Martin didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," he said. "But not tonight." Ralph didn't press him. He just nodded and leaned back into the quiet. When violence broke out, when bomb threats came to their homes, when crosses burned in yards, they didn't answer with fists. They answered with presents. Ralph showed up at houses that had been bombed, not with reporters, but with groceries and warm coats. He knew that people didn't need speeches. They needed someone who would knock on the door and say, "You're not alone." It wasn't the kind of leadership that made headlines. It was the kind that held the seams together. In every town, there were long nights. In every city, quiet fears. But Ralph never left early. He was the last to eat, the last to speak, the last to rest. He believed movements were measured not by how loud you were, but by how long you stayed. Would you like me to continue with part 5, the last night in Memphis and the moment before the shot? The air in Memphis that evening was still, almost unnaturally so. The Lorraine Motel sat quietly under a pale sky, with the sounds of traffic muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Inside room 306, Ralph Abernathy sat in a chair near the window, his jacket folded neatly over the back. Martin paced slowly near the bed, hands in his pockets, eyes tracing invisible lines along the carpet. They hadn't said much that afternoon. There was no need. After more than a decade of walking side by side, silence between them had become a kind of language. They had come to Memphis to support sanitation workers on strike, men who carried the city's waste and were treated like they were disposable. It wasn't a grand mission. It was a quiet stand for dignity. Martin looked tired. Not just from travel or work. It was a deeper kind of weariness, the kind that settles in the bones when you've carried too much for too long. Ralph saw it in the way Martin rubbed his temple with his thumb, how he lingered at the window, not watching anything in particular. "You should eat something," Ralph said softly. Martin nodded, but didn't move. They talked a little about the next day's schedule. About the march. About going home. There was a moment, just before the sun dipped below the horizon, when Ralph looked over and saw Martin standing still, his hands folded in front of him, his head slightly bowed. "What are you thinking?" Ralph asked. Martin took a breath, slow and steady. "That I'm more at peace than I thought I'd be." It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't foreboding. Just a quiet confession from a man who had seen too much and somehow still carried hope. Later, just before they were to head to dinner at a friend's home, Martin stepped out onto the balcony. He turned, smiled down toward the courtyard, and called back into the room. "Ralph, you ready? They're waiting on us." Ralph reached for his coat. And then the shot came. The silence that followed wasn't the absence of noise. It was the sound of something sacred leaving the world. Ralph ran. He didn't scream. He didn't freeze. He did what he had always done. He went to where he was needed and knelt beside his friend. In that moment, with blood warm on his hands and the echo of Martin's voice still hanging in the air, Ralph didn't cry out. He prayed. It wasn't a prayer of anger or desperation. It was the kind of prayer a man says when he knows the fight will go on, but the one he trusted most won't be there to walk beside him. Would you like me to continue with part 6, MLK's death and Ralph's quiet leadership afterward? In the days that followed, the world moved with a kind of stunned slowness. Crowds gathered. News anchors spoke with solemn voices. Tributes poured in from every direction. But Ralph Abernathy stayed quiet. He didn't offer speeches or grand reflections. He walked through each day like a man carrying something too sacred to set down. At the funeral, he sat near the front, but not in the center. He didn't want the cameras on him. He didn't want to be asked how he felt. Some things were too deep for words. What he did instead was return to the work. He stepped into Martin's role at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, not to replace him, but to make sure the movement kept moving. The goals hadn't changed. The need hadn't gone away. So Ralph gathered the team. He reopened the notebooks. He made the phone calls. He led the Poor People's Campaign to Washington, D.C., a vision Martin had started, one focused not just on race, but on poverty and human dignity. It was a quieter campaign. Less covered, more questioned. But Ralph stayed with it. He sat with workers, walked through makeshift encampments, listened to mothers talk about rent and medicine and pride. One night, after a long meeting in a church basement, someone asked him how he was holding up. Ralph didn't answer right away. He looked down at the floor, then said, "I don't know if I'm the right one to lead. But I do know I couldn't walk away." And that was always who he was, not the loudest voice in the room, but the one who stayed when others went home. Would you like me to continue with Part 7, the final years and the quiet legacy of Ralph Abernathy? In the years that followed, Ralph Abernathy never stopped walking the slow road. He kept attending meetings even when the crowds grew smaller. He kept speaking softly even when the world seemed to reward the loud. There were days when the headlines had moved on, when the microphones no longer pointed in his direction. But Ralph never needed the spotlight. He only ever wanted to be faithful. He continued to serve through the 1970s, taking on challenges no longer guided by Martin's voice but shaped by the memory of it. He visited union halls, small-town churches, city halls, places where people still believed in the quiet power of showing up. He didn't carry bitterness, though there were times he could have. He saw allies drift away, saw promises made to the poor delayed or ignored. But he still answered the phone. Still prayed before every step. In 1989, Ralph published his memoir. Not to make himself a hero, but to make sure the story was told true. He called it "And the Walls Came Tumbling Down." The pages didn't shout. They confessed. He wrote about doubt. About loneliness. About what it meant to love a friend so deeply that their absence could still echo across decades. The following year, Ralph grew ill. He didn't announce it. He simply began to slow down. Close friends visited his bedside. Some expected him to reflect on the movement, on history, on legacy. But Ralph mostly asked about their families. He wanted to know who was taking care of the grandchildren. Whether the church roof was still leaking. Small things, but never unimportant. When he passed in April 1990, the country mourned, though not with parades or statues. His funeral was simple. Honest. Familiar. On his tombstone, there are only 2 words. I tried. Not, I changed the world. Not, I led a movement. Just a quiet truth from a man who walked beside giants and never once left their side. He didn't need more than that. Because sometimes, the greatest legacy isn't carved in marble or shouted from podiums. It's whispered from a life lived with quiet conviction. Would you like me to continue with Part 8, the closing reflection to draw meaning for the viewer today? Some people change history with their words. Others, with their presence. Ralph Abernathy was never the loudest voice in the room. He didn't need to be. He stood beside a man who carried a dream, and made sure that dream didn't fall when the burden grew too heavy. He was the steady hand. The quiet witness. The friend who stayed behind to lock the doors and sweep the floor after the crowds had gone home. History may not always remember his name first. But those who walked with him knew. He was the one who kept the fire lit.